of the protests and found it very difficult to navigate this. Of course, there were also tensions in those moments that felt, particularly for white students on campus, and I think white staff as well, as being anti-white. And so I'm trying to speak to some of this. Attempts to moderate this rage and the other through retaliation, retreat or interpretation are unlikely or are likely to be experienced as a foreclosure of jouissance and may very well invite further denigration. So what to do? It is perhaps precisely in the apparent irresolvability of the race binary that the value of this endeavor may be found. It is here that we are engaged in an infinite iterative process that is premised on the acknowledgement of a seeming paralysis that then keeps open the very possibilities for a desiring subject to seek closure. And it's always open to the possibilities of psychosocial reorganization, recalibration, and change. Again, the point that I'm making is that it's precisely in the paralysis that we attempt to seek a resolution to that paralysis. It is in deficit that we, an experience of deficit, that we also experience desire. I want to make a point about South African, beyond South Africa, because I think it's important to recognize that while this was happening in South Africa, of course there's also decolonial forms and praxis to be found in a range of intellectual lineages and genealogies, including the works of Lumumba, Sobukwe, Nkrumah, Biko, and others. In North America, it gained traction through Garveyism and movements such as the Harlem Renaissance, in a response to a history of chattel slavery, the Jim Crow laws, and movements stressing a return to Africa. In the Caribbean, the history of the Middle Passage and its shaping of the entire social and political terrain, together with the important work on negritude, helped to propel these ideas. In Latin America, successive dictatorships prompted a turn to radical pedagogies of freedom, de-ideologization, liberation theology, and liberation psychology. In Aotearoa, the focus was on indigeneity and the defense of Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander, and Maori peoples, with a focus on decolonizing praxis. In Africa, the independence movements of the mid-20th century highlighted heightened calls for Afrocentricity, African socialism, and Pan-Africanism. And in India, the independence movement and the Quit India movement helped to craft a further iteration of decoloniality, suggesting that the perpetual return of race is simply a static representation of the same old vexing problem is simply untrue. And a thorough analysis of history suggests that with every return of an iteration of race, there are alternative ways of resisting this. It would also be a problem because it would suggest that everything that I've just mentioned about the history of decolonial and anti-colonial struggles across the world would have had no incremental value to the anti-racist project, decoloniality, and a critical humanist project. So, my third point is really to look at some of the challenges. I suppose what I'm talking about here is new frontiers and critical humanism. But I want to talk firstly about some of the challenges that we face when we talk about a combative and adversarial politics that has been so central to critical race praxis. Of course, it's had challenges. With the rise to prominence of post-structuralism and the discursive turn, questions as to whether it was possible to undo race, yet continue to reinscribe it through speaking and doing it abounded. Again, people like Goldberg and Gilroy amongst those who weighed in on this debate, as did writers such as Neville Alexander in South Africa, and of course people like Dimitri Erasmus more recently, in her book Race Otherwise. Of course, this is not simply a philosophical question, but has very real material stakes. The stakes are high in this set of questions. Is race a proxy for other modes of inequality such as class? Does race deserve its own status that reflects on the metaphysics of being, what it means to be black in the world? Is race a market identifier under neoliberalism? Or is it merely an empty signifier, and should we be moving on to something beyond race? These, of course, raise matters of the race-class debate, as well as the fundamental possibilities or impossibilities for a post-racial politics in society. Writers such as Goldberg in The Threat of Race and Gilroy in Against Race have argued for a deliberate repudiation of race and racial thinking. They both argue, but to different degrees, that the historical conditions for the emergence and maintenance of race have changed so fundamentally that racial thinking and even anti-racialism, now make the distinction between anti-racialism and anti-racism, yeah, have now been co-opted into newer forms of racial neoliberalism, cultural commodification, and continue to discursively reinscribe the bondage of race thinking that has very little to do with former attempts to resist and to forge a collective solidarity against racism. So just think about the way that features of black consciousness encouraging the black pride, love, self-love, etc., was also accompanied by kind of market forces that were able to appropriate this through products like Dark and Lovely. Yeah? The elasticity of capital, in some ways, aligns itself with the elasticity of race, constantly appropriating and attempting to reappropriate moments of resistance. And I'll talk a little bit more about this. Gilroy in particular argues for more plural forms of identification in a planetary humanism. And of course, there's no doubt that I'm oversimplifying these arguments, but time does not permit a more exhaustive analysis thereof. However, while the kernel at the heart of these arguments may not necessarily hold for contexts outside of the UK and the USA as much, they do signal, and this is important from Gilroy's work, that we need to be cautious and vigilant of the ways in which even the anti-racist project may lose credibility through being appropriated, resulting in race moving forwards and backwards simultaneously, according to him. This relationship between race and the market is an important one, but of course it's not a new one. Fanon, of course, and Drusilla was reflecting on this early on, raised caution about this early relationship between race and the market in the newly independent ex-colonies, and noted that within the comprador bourgeoisie, the spoiled children, and I quote, spoiled children of yesterday's colonialism and of today's national governments, they organize the loot of whatever national resources exist. Without pity, they use today's national distress as a means of getting on through scheming and legal robbery. By import-export combines, limited liability companies, gambling on the stock exchange or unfair promotion, they are insistent in their demands for the nationalization of commerce. That is to say, the reservation of markets and advantageous bargains for nationals only. As far as doctrine is concerned, they proclaim the pressing necessity of nationalizing the robbery of the nation. Encounters that many of us, of course, are familiar with in South Africa over the last 10 years. But of course, in thinking about race in the context of neoliberalism, writers like Ornette Clennon have also highlighted how the disavowal between blackness and whiteness over the centuries has been clearly transformed into market obscuration and segmentation via the mechanisms of market freedom and individuality. In so doing, becoming more about market relations than race per se, where individuality becomes a market proxy for whiteness. In other words, what looks like anti-racist work sometimes gets absorbed into the market, and the market itself benefits from this. Clennon uses the example of young rappers who ostensibly find themselves, initially they are working on their music in prison, and talks about how it is that what they appear to think is an anti-racist message gets co-opted repeatedly by large-scale music production houses for a whole range of other things. It's not only about money, but it's also about reproducing a particular notion of what the black subject is. However, in returning to the fundamental question about the possibilities of a post-racial politics, like the proverbial child on a lengthy journey who asks the question, are we there yet? The answer in South Africa is probably no, not yet. This is a distinct difference with many writers on the Black Atlantic from Europe and the USA. And this is important in our own analytic and knowledge production processes within the context of decolonization in the post-colonial context. The valence of race in its relationship to modes of exploitation has not been exhausted, and its currency as a mode of difference and inequality remains largely visible within South Africa, and indeed in many parts of Africa and the globe today. To argue that the exploitive function of race is no longer relevant and has vanished is simply erroneous, and the lived realities of many will testify to this. While we clearly are witnessing new identities and subjectivities, the post-apartheid distributional regime is very much racist. Despite the growth in the black middle class and the super elite, race remains a fracture for material inequality and for the vast majority of South Africans, with higher intergroup Gini coefficients today than we've ever seen before. In maintaining its current developmental pathway, South Africa has essentially sacrificed addressing race on the altar of the market. Given the historical relationship between race and class in the evolution of South Africa's economy, South Africa has largely consoled itself with forms of multiracialism within a discourse of non-racialism. So there's a ruse going on here for more than 2 decades in the service of ensuring the continuity of neoliberalism. But race is very much alive, and in the words of Cornel West, race matters. As a consequence, we witness a range of problematic deployments of race and race thinking at present. Ironically, race is accounted to the deleterious effects of our racialized history through illustrating the developmental gains of blacks, the racialization of crime, HIV, AIDS, social protest, racialized interpersonal relating, intergroup conflicts, and forms of racialized electioneering in the service of political entrepreneurship, as I mentioned earlier. Globally, of course, it's also important to recognize that Africa still finds itself immersed in a world that is dominated by the normativity of whiteness, and so race continues to be a real socio-cultural phenomenon or field that shapes social relations, subjectivity, and habitus globally. Furthermore, we have to be cognizant of how this is integral to new forms of global development that are now defined as North-South relations. Yeah? So instead of talking about race, we talk about North-South. As well as the manner in which race is mutating in the service of new modes of discrimination, exploitation, and so on, through anti-immigrant sentiment, Islamophobia, and so on. This seems to me, a post-race society seems to me to be utopian under these circumstances. While many of us look to a time and place where race will no longer matter, where it will be a figment of our history, that history is perhaps yet still to come to this place that we know as South Africa and Africa. I want to end off with, I see I've used 40 minutes, so I'm going to take 2 or 3 minutes and I'll finish off. Yeah? So I want to finish off by saying that despite these ongoing challenges, there are also newer ways or newer frontiers of a relationship between race and critical humanism. And here again, I draw on the work of Alexander Weyerlier as an example, and his book, Habeas Viscus, in which he suggests that the Western modernist thought has missed the centrality of the role of race in crafting the distinctions between humans, not quite humans, and non-humans, and that rather than race being an effect of these conceptions of humanity, that is in fact central to the birthing of modern Western liberal conceptions of man, woman. In other words,